On November 20th, 1943, Red Beach 2 on Island was not a place where Marines landed. It was a place where Marines drowned before they could fight. The coral reef 500 yards from shore had turned the ocean into a killing floor. Every step through chest-deep water was measured in seconds, and every second was measured by Japanese machine gun fire from concrete bunkers that naval bombardment had failed to crack. The beach was not contested. It was already won by the reef, the tide charts that lied, and the guns that never stopped. The landing vehicle track, the Amtrak, was supposed to solve everything. It could cross reefs. It had armor. It carried 30 Marines from ship to shore in one piece. The Navy had spent 2 years building them, and the planners had spent 6 months calculating tide tables that promised 4 feet of water over the coral. But on that morning, the tide came in 18 inches short, and 18 inches was the difference between a vehicle and a coffin. Amtracs grounded on coral heads 3 football fields from the beach. Their ramps dropped into water that came up to a man's chest, and the machine guns were already firing. By noon, 1,500 Marines were casualties. Most of them never made it past the reef. Private First Class from 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines made it because his squad died around him in the water. 8 men went into the surf together. He came out alone, not because he was faster or smarter or braver, because the machine gun that cut through his fire team ran out of ammunition 3 seconds before it reached him. He dragged himself behind a wrecked Amtrak on the left flank of Red Beach 2, a stretch of sand that the Japanese had already turned into a graveyard and that American command had quietly written off by 10 in the morning. He was not a hero. He was a statistical error, a man who survived when the math said he should not have. And because nobody expected him to be alive, nobody came looking for him. Island was not chosen because it was strategic. It was chosen because it was unavoidable. Between Pearl Harbor and Tokyo lay 3,800 miles of ocean, and the only way across that ocean was through a chain of Japanese-held atolls that stretched like a fortress wall from the Gilbert Islands to the Marshalls to the Admiral Chester and General Holland Smith had drawn the line on the map in August of 1943. The line said, "Take Tarawa first, or die trying to go around it." The atoll sat at the center of the Gilbert Islands. Its airstrip could hit American supply lines in both directions. Its garrison could call reinforcements from Rabaul, from the entire Japanese defensive perimeter that had held since 1942. If Tarawa stayed Japanese, the island-hopping strategy died before it started, so the Americans had to take it. The Japanese knew this. They had spent 18 months turning into a square mile of reinforced concrete, machine gun nests, and overlapping fields of fire. They had 4,500 men dug into bunkers that 3 days of naval bombardment barely scratched. The Americans needed Tarawa because the math to Tokyo required it. The Japanese had built Tarawa because their math said the Americans would come. Both sides were right, and that was the problem. The plan was elegant. 3 days of carrier strikes and naval gunfire would flatten the island. The battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee would fire 16-inch shells into every bunker, every gun emplacement, every suspected defensive position on. Then the Marines would land, mop up survivors, and raise the flag by nightfall. Holland Smith told reporters the bombardment would leave nothing standing. The Navy fired 3,000 tons of high explosive onto 1 square mile of coral and concrete. Pilots reported the island looked dead. It was not dead, it was waiting. The Japanese had built their bunkers with double walls of reinforced concrete and coconut logs layered 3 feet thick. The naval shells hit like sledgehammers, but sledgehammers do not crack safes. They dent them. Most of the bunkers survived. Most of the machine guns survived. And when the first wave of Marines came off the reef at 8:30 in the morning, every gun that survived opened fire at the same time. The Japanese commander had spent 18 months mapping every approach, every depression in the coral, every line of sight from his gun positions to the water. He did not need to adjust fire. He already knew where the Americans would walk. By 11 in the morning, 75% of some rifle companies were casualties. By noon, battalion commanders were calling for reinforcements that could not land because the reef was still crowded with dead men and wrecked Amtracs. The doctrine had been tested at Guadalcanal, at a dozen smaller islands. The doctrine said, bombard, land, overwhelm. The doctrine had worked before because those islands did not have 4,500 defenders with 18 months to dig in. Tarawa was different. The math was different, and the Marines who realized this were already dead. The private did not find safety. He found a blind spot. The Japanese bunkers on the left flank of Red Beach 2 had been positioned to cover 3 approach lanes: the waterline, the tidal shelf at 50 yards, and the at 100 yards. Their machine guns were sighted for targets that moved: Marines who crawled, Marines who ran, Marines who tried to dig in and got hit anyway because the gunners had pre-registered every square foot of sand. But the wrecked Amtrak he crouched behind sat in a place the Japanese had already written off. It was 20 yards past the waterline, angled into the coral at 45 degrees, its front ramp blown open and its cargo space filled with bodies. The gunners could see it, but they did not waste ammunition on wreckage. He understood something the planners had not. The Japanese doctrine was not designed to kill every Marine. It was designed to kill every Marine who followed American doctrine: move forward, take ground, establish a beachhead. The Japanese had spent 18 months calculating where those Marines would be, and they had built their defenses to meet them there. But the private was not moving forward. He was sitting in a place the enemy had already fired through, a place they assumed was clear because everything in it should have been dead an hour ago. He stayed still. He watched the bunker 70 yards to his right chew through another fire team trying to reach the. He watched 2 Marines make it 15 feet before the gun found them. He watched the sand kick up in a straight line from the waterline to the spot where they fell. He did not move to help them. He did not move at all, because movement was the algorithm the Japanese were hunting, and the only way to break an algorithm is to stop feeding it data. The tide went out. The bodies around him stiffened in the sun. Radio traffic from the command ship went silent on this sector because the radios were underwater or shattered or held by men who could not answer. As far as the Navy knew, the left flank of Red Beach 2 was lost. As far as the Japanese knew, it was already won. He was alive because both sides had stopped counting him. The first rifle he took came from a corporal who had made it 10 feet past the Amtrak before a machine gun burst caught him across the chest. The M1 was still dry, still loaded, 8 rounds in the clip. The private crawled back to the wreckage and laid the rifle next to his own. Then he went back for another. By the time the sun hit its highest point, he had 5 lined up against the inside wall of the Amtrak. 40 rounds total if every rifle was full. Most were not. He found 23 rounds scattered across ammunition belts from Marines who had dropped them in the water or torn them off trying to move faster under fire. He found 4 grenades. 2 of them were wet. He set those aside because wet grenades either worked or killed the man holding them, and there was no way to know which until the pin was pulled. He did not find water. Every canteen he checked was either empty or punctured or so full of coral sand that drinking it would shred his throat. Thirst was already setting in. It had been 4 hours since he came off the landing craft, and the sun on did not forgive. He arranged the rifles in sequence. Rifle 1 closest to his right hand fully loaded. Rifle 2 6 rounds. Rifle 3 5 rounds. Rifle 4 3 rounds. Rifle 5 empty but ready in case he needed the bayonet. He stacked the ammunition belts where he could reach them without looking. He placed the 2 dry grenades on a flat piece of coral at arm's length. Then he studied the sand in front of his position. 30 feet of open ground between the Amtrak and the nearest cover, a low berm of coral and debris that the tide had pushed up during the bombardment. Anyone coming from the Japanese bunkers would have to cross that ground. There was no other way. He cleared 3 coral rocks from the center of the approach so nothing would trip a man running at him. He wanted them upright. He wanted them close. He wanted them sure they had found an easy target. This was not a defense. It was a trap built from dead men's equipment, and the only bait he had was himself. The radio traffic stopped at 2 in the afternoon, not because someone gave an order. Because there was no one left on the left flank to report to. The last transmission from 2nd Battalion had come in at 1:15. Red Beach 2 left sector, heavy casualties, request immediate support. The reply came back at 1:30. No assets available, hold position. After that, silence. The command ship waited 20 minutes for confirmation. When none came, they marked the sector as contested and moved their attention to the center beach where Marines were still dying in real time and radios were still working. The private had no radio. His had gone into the water with the squad leader, and the squad leader had gone down in 8 feet of surf with a bullet through his throat. So he did not know the Navy had stopped listening. He did not know that as far as division command was concerned, his position was either overrun or abandoned. He only knew that the sun was starting to sink, and when the sun went down the Japanese came out. Night attacks were doctrine for them. Wait until the Americans dug in. Wait until they thought the day was over. Then hit them in the dark when their fields of fire meant nothing and their artillery support could not see targets. It had worked on Guadalcanal. It had worked on. The Japanese called it night infiltration. The Marines called it getting killed in your foxhole. And the private was not in a foxhole. He was behind a piece of wreckage with 5 rifles, 23 rounds, and 2 grenades. No support, no reinforcements, no radio to call for help even if help existed. He checked the rifles again. He counted the ammunition again. He looked at the 30 feet of open sand in front of him and understood that had changed. During the day, the Japanese stayed in their bunkers because American planes and ships could see them. At night, the planes were gone. The ships were blind. The Japanese owned the darkness, and they would come to reclaim the beach they thought they had already won. 14 hours until sunrise. 14 hours alone with the certainty that eventually someone on the other side would notice the wrecked Amtrak was still occupied. And when they noticed, they would come to fix that problem. He could leave, crawl back to the waterline. Try to reach the center beach where the fighting was still organized. But crawling meant crossing 200 yards of open ground in darkness through a kill zone the Japanese had spent 18 months mapping. Staying meant fighting. Leaving meant dying on the way out. The choice was not between good options. It was between one bad option and one worse option. He stayed, not because he was brave. Because the math to survival was simpler here than anywhere else on this island. And simple math was all he had left. The first 2 came at 10 past midnight. Scouts, moving low and quiet along the waterline, checking the wrecked Amtracs for anything useful. Weapons, ammunition, intelligence. They were not looking for survivors because survivors on this beach had either retreated or died hours ago. The private watched them through the torn hull plating. 60 feet away, 50, 40. They moved past the first Amtrak without stopping. They reached his position and one of them climbed onto the ramp, silhouetted against the stars. He fired twice. Both men went down. He did not wait to confirm. He pulled rifle 2 into position and watched the sand where they had come from. No movement. No return fire. After 5 minutes, he crawled forward and dragged the bodies behind the Amtrak. One of them carried a pistol and a pouch with 3 full magazines. He took both. The other had a canteen that still had water in it. He drank half and saved the rest. The second wave came 40 minutes later. 8 men this time, not scouts, assault troops. They knew someone had killed the scouts and they came to kill whoever had done it. They moved in a wedge formation, rifles up, spacing between them measured and professional. The private let them close to 25 feet. Then he opened fire. He emptied rifle 2. Switched to rifle 3, kept firing. The Japanese scattered, but they did not retreat. 2 went down in the first burst. 3 more dropped behind coral cover and started returning fire. Bullets punched through the Amtrak hull. Ricochet screamed off metal. He stayed low, counted 3 seconds, then shifted position to the opposite side of the wreck and fired again. 1 more down. The remaining 3 closed the distance. 15 feet, 10 feet. He threw the first grenade. The explosion lit up the beach for half a second. When the light died, 2 of them were on the ground. The third one made it to the Amtrak and came around the corner with a bayonet. The private shot him at 4 feet with the pistol he had taken off the scout. Silence again. 11 bodies now. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline burn. He reloaded rifle 3 from the ammunition belt. 13 rounds left total. He checked himself for wounds. A piece of shrapnel from the grenade had torn through his left trouser leg and opened a gash across his calf. Not deep, not bleeding heavy, but it hurt. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from a dead Marine's shirt and went back to watching the sand. The third wave hit at 2:30 in the morning. This time they were not probing. They were coming to erase the problem. 15, maybe 20. He could not count them all in the darkness. They came from two directions, half from the waterline, half from the inland bunkers, coordinated. Disciplined. They knew where he was, they knew he had limited ammunition, and they knew if they pressed hard enough he would run dry. He fired rifle 3 until it was empty, switched to rifle 4. 6 rounds. He made each one count. The Japanese kept coming. Grenades started landing near the Amtrac. One exploded close enough to blow coral fragments into his right arm. Another detonated against the hull and sent a piece of metal through his shoulder. He felt it punch through, felt the blood start running down his side. He dropped rifle 4 and picked up rifle 5. 3 rounds. He fired all 3 into the nearest cluster of movement. Then he grabbed the second grenade, pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds and threw it as hard as he could toward the inland approach. The blast caught 4 of them in the open. The rest hesitated. That hesitation gave him time to pick up the pistol and fire blind into the dark. Heard someone scream. Heard boots on coral retreating. When it stopped, he counted 9 more bodies in front of his position. 20 total now. He was bleeding from the shoulder and the arm and the leg. His hearing was half gone from the grenade blasts. His mouth tasted like copper and coral dust. He had no ammunition left except the pistol and whatever rounds were still in the magazines he had taken earlier. He reloaded the pistol. 12 rounds, that was all. If they came again, 12 rounds would have to be enough. The fourth wave came an hour before dawn. The rest of them, final push. They did not use tactics this time. They charged, screaming. Running straight at the Amtrac from every direction at once because they knew he was wounded and low on ammunition, and there was no reason to be careful anymore. He fired until it clicked empty. Then he picked up the rifle with the bayonet and stood up. His shoulder was on fire. His leg would barely hold weight, but standing was the only option left. The first man reached the Amtrac and came over the top. The private drove the bayonet into his chest, pulled it out, turned. Second man, bayonet again. Third man tackled him from the side. They went down together. He lost the rifle, found a rock, hit the man in the head with it until the man stopped moving. Fourth man came around the corner. The private grabbed realized it was still empty, and threw it at the man's face. It bought him 2 seconds, enough time to find the rifle again, enough time to drive the bayonet forward one more time. Then it stopped, not because he won, because there was no one left to fight. The sun was starting to rise, the beach was quiet. He leaned against the Amtrac and looked at the sand in front of him. Bodies everywhere, stacked in some places, scattered in others. He counted 27 in the immediate area. When the Marines from the center beach reached his position 3 hours later, they counted 47 total within a 100-yard radius of the wrecked Amtrac. He was still sitting there, still bleeding, still alive. They asked him his name. It took him 3 tries to remember how to answer. The corpsman who reached him first thought he was already dead. The private was gray. His pulse was thin. His eyes were open but not tracking. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder had gone through the meat below the collarbone and nicked something that bled slow but steady for 6 hours. The gash on his calf had dirt and coral sand ground into it deep enough that infection was guaranteed. His right forearm had 3 separate fragment wounds, none of them serious individually, but together they had torn through enough muscle that his hand would not close properly. He had not had water in 14 hours except for the half canteen he took off the dead scout. His lips were cracked. His tongue was swollen. When they tried to move him, he fought them because his brain had not yet understood the fighting was over. They carried him back to the center beach on a stretcher. It took 4 men because the path was still clogged with wreckage and bodies. They passed Marines sitting in the sand staring at nothing. They passed a pile of dog tags stacked next to a chaplain who was trying to count them and kept losing track. They passed a burned-out Amtrac with 12 bodies inside it, fused together by heat and salt water into something that did not look like men anymore. The private saw all of this and registered none of it. His mind had turned off everything except the mathematics of survival, and now that the math was solved, there was nothing left to process. Red Beach 2 had cost 1,500 Marines in 3 days. Some of them drowned, some of them burned, some of them bled out in the coral waiting for help that never came. The private had killed 47 enemy soldiers in 14 hours and survived wounds that should have killed him twice. The Navy would call it heroism. The Corps would call it initiative. The men who pulled him off that beach called it luck, and they were closer to the truth. He had done what the system could not. But the system had spent 1,500 men proving that his solution was not scalable. You could not train luck. You could not distribute improvisation. You could not doctrine your way into the kind of arithmetic that kept one man alive while everyone around him died. He spent 6 weeks in a field hospital on Hawaii. The shoulder healed wrong. The leg healed worse. His hand never worked the same. When they asked him if he wanted to go back to his unit, he said yes, because the only thing worse than going back was staying behind. But they did not send him back. They sent him home, not because he was broken. Because the Corps had learned something from watching him break, and they needed time to figure out what it was. The after-action reports from Tarawa filled 200 pages. Most of it was predictable: tide miscalculations, insufficient bombardment, underestimated defensive positions, the kind of mistakes that get men killed and then get written down so the next operation does not repeat them. But buried in the middle of the report in a section marked Individual Actions of Note, there was a paragraph about the private and the wrecked Amtrak on the left flank of Red Beach 2. It did not call him a hero. It called him an anomaly, a statistical outlier who survived by violating every principle of amphibious assault doctrine. He did not advance. He did not consolidate. He did not link up with adjacent units. He stayed in place, fortified a non-strategic position, and killed 47 enemy soldiers using improvised methods that could not be taught or replicated. The analysts at Fleet Marine Force Pacific read that paragraph 6 times trying to understand what it meant. On paper, the private had done everything wrong. But he was alive, and the Marines who followed doctrine were not. That gap between theory and survival started a conversation that lasted 3 months and ended with changes to the amphibious warfare manual that nobody announced and nobody apologized for. They just quietly appeared in the next edition. The new doctrine acknowledged something the old one had refused to consider. Forward momentum was not always the correct answer. Sometimes holding ground you already took was worth more than taking ground you could not keep. The private had understood this by accident. The Corps understood it by counting bodies. Tarawa taught them that the enemy gets a vote, that defensive positions built with 18 months of preparation do not collapse in 3 days of bombardment, that Marines drowning in chest-deep water cannot take a beach no matter how brave they are, and that sometimes the men who survive are the ones who stop playing the game the enemy designed. By the time the Marines hit in September of 1944, the landing plans looked different. More Amtracs, better tide calculations, longer bombardments, and a new line in the tactical orders that allowed unit commanders to consolidate and defend rather than advance if forward movement meant unacceptable casualties. The phrase they used was tactical flexibility. What it meant was, if the doctrine is killing you, stop following it. No officer would say that out loud, but it was written into the manual now, in careful language, in the kind of phrasing that let commanders make decisions without admitting the old way had been wrong. The private never saw the manual. He was home by then, working a job that did not ask questions about the scars on his shoulder or why his hand shook when he tried to hold a cup of coffee. He did not know that his name was in a report. He did not know that report had changed anything. And if someone had told him, he would not have cared. He had not been trying to prove a point. He had been trying not to die. The fact that the Corps learned something from watching him do it was not his concern. He had done his part. The rest was their problem. It took the Navy 7 days to get his name right. The first casualty report listed him as missing, presumed dead. The second report corrected that to wounded in action, but spelled his name wrong and assigned him to the wrong battalion. The third report fixed the name, but lost the details of what he had done. By the time someone in division headquarters connected the private on the stretcher to the 47 bodies on the left flank, the battle was over and the press had moved on to the next island. There was no ceremony, no photograph, no reporter asking him how it felt to be a hero, just a Purple Heart that arrived in the mail 8 months later with a form letter signed by someone he had never met. He went back to civilian life the way most veterans did, quietly, without talking about it. He took a job at a manufacturing plant outside of Philadelphia, got married, had 2 kids. Told them almost nothing about the war except that he had been a Marine and that Tarawa was hot. When other veterans asked where he served, he said the Pacific and left it at that. When they pressed for details, he changed the subject. Not because he was modest, because talking about it required explaining things that people who were not there could not understand. And explaining things took energy he did not have. The medals came later. A Silver Star in 1948, a commendation from the Commandant of the Marine Corps in 1952, a mention in a military history book published in 1961 that got his name wrong again. By then, he was 50 years old and working the same job he had started after the war. Nobody at the plant knew he had a Silver Star. Nobody asked, and he did not bring it up, because the distance between what he had done on and what his life had become afterward was so vast that connecting the two felt like lying. He had killed 47 men in one night, and then he had come home and spent 30 years making parts for refrigerators. Both things were true. Neither one explained the other. The doctrine that sent Marines onto Red Beach 2 was not stupid. It was logical, mathematically sound, based on battles that had worked before, on islands that had fallen before, on calculations that balanced firepower against time against acceptable losses. The experts who wrote it knew more about amphibious warfare than any private with a rifle. They had studied Gallipoli. They had analyzed Guadalcanal. They had drawn trajectories and calculated blast radiuses and tested equipment under conditions that simulated combat. They were right about almost everything. And they were still wrong. Because doctrine measures what can be measured: the weight of naval bombardment, the speed of landing craft, the thickness of concrete bunkers, the number of enemy troops per square mile. What it cannot measure is the moment when one man looks at the wreckage around him and decides that forward is the wrong direction. That staying is survival, that the algorithm everyone else is following leads to death, and the only way out is to stop playing the game the enemy designed. You cannot doctrine your way into that decision. You cannot train it. You cannot replicate it across 1,500 men. It happens once in one place to one person who had 6 bullets left and no other options. And then it changes the manual, not because the manual was wrong about the math, but because wars are not won on paper. They are won by people who survive long enough to prove that the math was incomplete. This is the kind of story that does not get told often, not because it is not true, but because it does not fit the narrative wars are sold with. If you want more stories like this, stories that respect the math and the men who had to solve it, subscribe. There are more battles where the experts were right and still lost. More moments where survival came down to one decision nobody planned for. More history that matters.